Welcome, dear listener, to another gentle journey through the shadows of history. Tonight, we invite you to settle back, perhaps pull a soft blanket closer, and allow your mind to drift into the cobblestone streets and timber-framed houses of centuries past. You are safe here, in your comfortable present, wrapped in the certainty of science and reason. So we explored a time when safety was a luxury few could afford, and when superstition ruled with an iron fist. Please consider subscribing to the channel and drop a comment below. Imagine, if you will, the peculiar terror of living in a world where your very existence as a woman could be interpreted as evidence of evil. Picture villages where neighbors watched neighbors with suspicious eyes, where children were taught to fear their own grandmothers, and where the line between healing and harming, between wisdom and witchcraft, was drawn not by truth, but by collective fear. In the centuries between 1450 and 1750, across the mist-shrouded moors of Scotland, the dense forests of Germany, and the harsh wilderness of colonial New England, to be a woman was to navigate a labyrinth of unspoken rules and deadly accusations. The numbers alone tell a chilling story. Historical records suggest that between 40,000 and 60,000 people met their deaths during the witch trials, and of these, roughly 80% were women. But behind these stark statistics lie countless individual stories of terror, survival, and tragedy. These were mothers who brewed healing teas, widows who lived alone, midwives who delivered difficult births, and young women who spoke their minds too freely. We will walk together through 4 distinct yet interconnected worlds tonight, each offering a window into this dark chapter of human history. First, we'll experience the daily rhythm of life in a village consumed by suspicion, where every glance carried weight, every word was measured against an invisible scale of guilt, and where the simple act of living as a woman required constant vigilance. Then, we'll witness the tragic fate of one woman caught in this web of fear, following her from accusation to execution. Our journey will lead us to hidden secrets, confessions, tucked away behind walls, speaking across centuries of desperation, truth, and the human need to be heard. Finally, we'll observe how those in power lived and died while the accused faced their final hours, revealing the stark contrast between the comfortable lives of judges and the suffering of the condemned. Let your breathing slow as we step back, in time where the smell of wood smoke mingles with whispered accusations, where church bells mark not just the hours, but the rhythm of fear itself, and where being a woman meant walking a tightrope between survival and suspicion, balanced precariously over an abyss of community paranoia and religious fervor. Dawn breaks slowly over the village of Wurzburg in the year Elio-Argel, painting the half-timber birdhouses in shades of amber and gold. The air carries the familiar sense of morning baking bread, wood smoke curling from chimneys, and the earthy smell of animals stirring in their stalls. Yet, beneath these comforting aromas lies something else, something invisible but palpable, the thick atmosphere of suspicion that has settled over this community like morning fog, refusing to lift even as the sun climbs higher. You wake as a woman in this village, and before your feet touch the cold wooden floor, you are already calculating the day ahead. Not the simple calculations of any housewife what to cook, chores to complete, but the complex mathematics of survival in a world where every action might be misinterpreted, every word twisted into evidence against you. The morning light filtering through your small window illuminates not just your modest room, but the invisible web of watching eyes and listening ears that surrounds every woman in this place. Your first task is to dress, but even this simple act requires careful consideration. The clothes you choose will speak before you do. Too fine, and you might be accused of vanity, or worse, of having gained wealth through supernatural means. Too poor, and you confirm suspicions that you are desperate enough to turn to dark powers for help. You settle on your everyday wool dress, brown as autumn leaves, neither rich nor ragged, hoping to blend into the background of ordinary life. As you step outside, the village reveals itself in all its contradictory beauty and menace. The morning sun illuminates gardens where herbs grow in neat rows, the same herbs that could heal a fever or, in the minds of your neighbors, summon devils. Children play in the dusty streets, their laughter bright and innocent. Yet their games often involve pretending to be witch hunters, mimicking the serious adult business of accusations and trials that has become the village's primary occupation. The baker's wife, Marguerite, tends her oven with practiced efficiency. The warmth radiating from the stone structure feels welcoming, but you notice how other women keep their distance from her. Last month, a batch of her bread had turned moldy unusually quickly, and whispers had begun. Nothing has been said openly, but the space around her stall has grown wider, as if suspicion were a contagious disease. You want to buy bread, but doing so might associate you with her potential guilt. Yet avoiding her might be seen as confirmation that she is indeed tainted. Every choice becomes a careful balance between your needs and your safety. The morning air fills with the sound of church, bells calling the faithful to prayer. Religion saturates every aspect of life here, but it offers no sanctuary from suspicion. Instead, it seems to heighten it. The local priest, Father Heinrich, preaches regularly about the devil's attempts to corrupt the faithful, particularly through the weakness of women. His sermons, delivered in Latin that few understand fully, nonetheless convey their message clearly. Evil walks among you, and it likely wears the face of your neighbor. As you walk through the village square, you become acutely aware of the way conversations halt when you approach, then resume in hushed tones after you pass. This is not paranoia. This is the reality of life for every woman here. The widow Anna sits on her doorstep, spinning wool with fingers that have grown gnarled with age and labor. She was once respected as a healer, sought out by mothers whose children burned with fever, or women struggling through difficult births. But respect has curdled into suspicion. Her success in healing is now seen as evidence of unnatural knowledge, her failures as proof of malevolent intent. The marketplace bustles with activity, but beneath the surface, negotiations of trade and gossip, another layer of communication flows. Glances are exchanged and interpreted, gestures noted and analyzed. The vegetables Maria sells are examined, not just for freshness, but for any sign of supernatural influence. When young Johann's pig died after eating her potatoes last week, the incident became another piece in the puzzle of her potential guilt. That the pig was old and sickly matters little. In a world where cause and effect had been replaced by supernatural logic, coincidence becomes evidence. You notice how the women move differently here, how they carry themselves with a careful awareness of being observed. Loud laughter is avoided, as it might suggest unseemly joy or, worse, the kind of wild abandon associated with midnight gatherings. Direct eye contact is carefully rationed. Too little might suggest guilt and evasion. Too much could be interpreted as the bold stare of one who traffics with dark powers. Even the way a woman walks becomes significant. A confident stride might suggest unnatural boldness, while a hurried gait could indicate someone fleeing from accusations not yet spoken. The children of the village have learned to participate in this atmosphere of suspicion. They watch their mothers, aunts, and grandmothers with eyes that have been trained to look for signs of wrongdoing. Some have even been called upon to testify against adult women, their innocence used as evidence of their reliability as witnesses. Young Greta, barely 7 years old, has already learned to view her grandmother's herb garden with suspicion. It's a question whether the teas that soothed her childhood ailments came from godly knowledge or darker sources. The rhythm of daily work continues despite the undercurrent of fear, but every task is performed under scrutiny. When you draw water from the well, other women note whether you speak to the water, whether you make any unusual gestures, whether the bucket fills normally, or seems to respond to your presence in any supernatural way. The simple act of cooking becomes fraught with significance. Herbs must be chosen carefully. Exotic, and you risk accusations of practicing magic. It's too common, and you might be seen as hiding your true knowledge behind ordinary appearances. Afternoon brings sewing circles, where women gather to mend and create while sharing news and gossip. These gatherings, once sources of comfort and community, have become careful performances of normalcy. Each woman monitors her words, ensuring that nothing she says could be twisted into evidence of supernatural knowledge or malicious intent. The needlework itself becomes symbolic. Intricate patterns might suggest the kind of detailed knowledge associated with spell weaving, while simple stitches could be seen as attempts to appear more innocent than one truly is. As evening approaches, the village takes on a different character. Shadows grow longer, and with them, the sense of invisible watchers seems to intensify. Candles are lit in windows, but their warm glow cannot dispel the chill of communal suspicion. The darkness outside is no longer just the absence of light. It has become a realm of potential supernatural activity, a time when the accused might slip away to practice their dark arts. The day ends as it began, with calculations and careful choices. Which neighbors to greet, which conversations to join, which activities to avoid. Sleep, when it finally comes, offers only temporary respite from the exhausting vigilance that defines a woman's existence in this time and place. Tomorrow will bring another day of navigating the treacherous landscape of suspicion, another 24 hours of proving innocence in a world that is already judged. You, guilty simply for being born female in this village. As in thousands of others across Europe and colonial America, the witch trials have created a reality where ordinary life becomes extraordinary in its danger, where the simple act of being a woman requires skills of survival that no mother could adequately teach her daughter, because the rules change with each accusation, each trial, each execution that reminds everyone that safety is an illusion and suspicion is the only constant truth. As weeks turn to months in this village of perpetual vigilance, you begin to understand that suspicion operates by its own peculiar economy. Fear has become a currency as real as silver coins, traded in glances and whispers, accumulated through careful observation, spent in the form of accusations that can purchase temporary safety for the accuser at the cost of another's life. The morning frost on your windowsill catches the early light, creating patterns that might once have seemed beautiful, but now remind you uncomfortably of the intricate symbols some claim to have seen carved near the homes of the accused. Your neighbor Elizabeth has begun to change in subtle ways that only another woman would notice. Her once confident stride has shortened to careful, measured steps. She, who used to hum while hanging laundry, now works in complete silence, as if music itself might be interpreted as some form of incantation. Last week, her cow produced an unusually large quantity of milk, and instead of celebrating this small blessing, she appeared genuinely distressed. Knowing that abundance without clear cause often invites unwanted attention and uncomfortable questions about its supernatural origins, the village wise woman, old Bertha, has stopped accepting visitors entirely. For 40 years, she delivered babies, set broken bones, and brewed remedies that eased pain and fever. Her knowledge, passed down through generations of women, once made her invaluable to the community. Now that same knowledge marks her as dangerous. The herbs she grows: chamomile for peaceful sleep, willow bark for pain, feverfew for women's ailments, are viewed with suspicion rather than gratitude. Each successful healing becomes potential evidence against her, each failure proof of malevolent Intent held in check only by community. KCHFULNESS. You observe how the social fabric of the village has been rewoven with threads of mistrust. The traditional gathering places where women once shared knowledge, comfort, and companionship have become spaces of careful performance. At the washing stones by the river, conversations that once flowed as freely as the water now follow prescribed channels. Talk of weather, crops, and household management is safe. Discussions of illness, strange dreams, or unusual occurrences must be navigated with the skill of a diplomat. Each word weighed for its potential to incriminate either the speaker or the subject. The children reflect this new reality in their play and behavior. Young boys swagger with newfound importance, having learned that their testimony against women can be taken as evidence in courts of law. They watch their mothers, sisters, and female neighbors with eyes trained to spot the signs adults have taught them to fear. Little Anna, barely 5 years old, has learned to flinch when her grandmother reaches for her, not from any personal fear, but because she has absorbed the community's suspicion that affection from older women might carry supernatural taint. The weekly market day reveals the economic dimension of this climate of fear. Women who once sold healing herbs now offer only common vegetables, their medicinal knowledge hidden like contraband. The prices of ordinary goods fluctuate not just with supply and demand, but with the reputation of the seller. Maria's eggs, once sought after for their size and richness, now sell slowly because whispers have begun about why her hens lay so much better than her neighbors. The irony is, bitter success in any endeavor becomes suspicious. Yet, failure can be interpreted as evidence of supernatural revenge against the community in the church each Sunday. You witness how religious devotion itself has become a performance requiring careful choreography. Women pray with visible fervor, but not too much fervor, lest enthusiasm be mistaken for the kind of religious ecstasy associated with diabolic possession. They sing hymns, but monitor their voices to ensure they neither stand out through excessive beauty nor fail to participate adequately. Even the act of taking communion becomes fraught with significance. Too eager an approach might suggest supernatural hunger, while reluctance could indicate the fear of holy objects that supposedly plagues those in league with dark forces. The seasonal rhythms that once provided comfort, predictability, have been corrupted by suspicion. Harvest time, traditionally a period of celebration and community cooperation, now breeds resentment and accusation. When Johan's crop fails while his neighbor's thrives, the failure is not attributed to poor soil or unfortunate weather, but to supernatural interference. Successful neighbor, rather than being congratulated, finds herself under subtle scrutiny. Her abundance becomes evidence not of hard work or good fortune, but of possible supernatural assistance obtained through unholy bargains. Winter brings its own particular terrors. The long, dark nights provide cover for the activities the community fears most, yet they also trap everyone indoors where suspicion can ferment like wine in a closed cask. Families huddle around their fires, but even these intimate gatherings are not free from the poison of mistrust. Mothers watch their daughters for signs of the supernatural corruption they've been taught to fear. Fathers question their wives about their daytime activities, their evening prayers, their dreams and private thoughts. The physical landscape of the village itself has been transformed by fear. Paths that women once walked freely now seem potentially dangerous, not because of wild animals or human bandits, but because solitary behavior might be interpreted as seeking privacy for supernatural activities. The forest edge, where women traditionally gathered medicinal plants and herbs, has become a boundary few dare to cross alone. Even the village well, a natural gathering place for generations, now sees women approaching in groups, each serving as witness to the other's ordinary behavior. Sleep, when it finally comes in this atmosphere of constant vigilance, brings no true rest. Dreams must be monitored and controlled, for even unconscious visions might be interpreted as supernatural visitations. Women wake each morning not refreshed, but exhausted from the mental effort of maintaining innocence even in their sleep. They check their bodies for any marks that might have appeared overnight, examine their clothes for signs of unauthorized nighttime wandering, search their minds for dream memories that might be used as evidence against them. The cumulative effect of living under such scrutiny weighs on every woman in the village, like a stone growing heavier with each passing day. The constant calculation required for survival, what to say, how to move, whom to trust, when to speak, when to remain silent, creates an exhaustion that runs deeper than physical fatigue. It settles into the bones, the mind, the very soul of female existence in this place and time. Each woman carries not just her own fear, but the reflected fear of every other woman, creating a collective burden that shapes their movements, their words, their very thoughts. Yet, perhaps most tragically, this atmosphere has begun to turn women against each other in ways that previous generations could never have imagined. The solidarity that once existed among the village's female population has been poisoned by the terrible logic of the trials. That safety might be purchased by directing suspicion towards someone else. The binding ties of shared experience, mutual aid, and feminine understanding have been stretched to breaking point by the corrosive effects of communal paranoia and the desperate mathematics of survival. The economic impact of sustained witch trial activity becomes apparent as resources are diverted from productive activities to the machinery of prosecution and punishment. The village must pay for the costs of imprisonment, trial procedures, and execution, while simultaneously losing the productive labor of the accused and their families. The blacksmith, who once shod horses, now spends his days forging chains and shackles. The carpenter, who built homes and barns, now constructs scaffolds and stakes. The very infrastructure of community life is being slowly transformed to serve the purposes of systematic persecution. Perhaps most insidiously, the witch trial atmosphere has begun to reshape the fundamental relationships between men and women in ways that will outlast any specific case or execution. Husbands view their wives with new suspicion. Fathers watch their daughters with fearful eyes. Sons learn to regard their mothers as potentially dangerous. The bonds of family, once considered sacred and unbreakable, prove vulnerable to the corroding effects of supernatural paranoia. Women learn to mistrust their own thoughts and feelings, to second-guess their own actions, to internalize the community's suspicion until they begin to question their own innocence. The seasonal cycle that once provided comfort and predictability has been permanently altered by the rhythm of accusations, trials, and executions. Spring brings not just the return of life to the fields and gardens, but anxiety about what new suspicions will emerge as people venture outdoors again after winter's enforced isolation. Summer's abundance becomes tainted by questions about whose prosperity is legitimate and whose might be supernaturally obtained. Autumn's harvest time brings not just gathering of crops, but gathering of grudges and grievances that have fermented through the year. Winter's forced intimacy allows suspicions to intensify until they reach the explosive point of formal accusation. As you settle into sleep in this village, transformed by fear, you understand that you have witnessed not just the persecution of individuals, but the systematic destruction of the social bonds that make community life possible. The witch trials have revealed themselves to be not aberrations or exceptions to normal human behavior, but extreme expressions of universal tendencies toward suspicion, scapegoating, and the desire to purchase safety through the sacrifice of others. In this small village, as in countless others across Europe and America, the machinery of accusation and execution grinds on, consuming lives and communities with mechanical efficiency, leaving behind only the bitter knowledge that civilization's veneer is thinner than anyone dared to believe. The transformation of a community under the weight of which trial hysteria reveals itself most clearly in the delicate mechanisms by which accusations form, gather momentum, and ultimately destroy lives. In this village, as autumn deepens toward winter, you witness how suspicion crystallizes into formal charges through a process as methodical as any craft, yet infinitely more deadly. The morning mist that clings to the village rooftops seems to mirror the fog of uncertainty that has settled over every interaction, every relationship, every moment of daily existence. You observe the careful choreography that precedes an accusation. It begins not with dramatic confrontations or sudden revelations, but with the accumulation of small observations, minor incidents, and whispered concerns that gather weight through repetition. The baker's wife, Marguerite, who has lived under a cloud of suspicion since her bread spoiled, becomes the focal point of increasingly intense scrutiny. Her neighbors begin to recall previous incidents with new significance. The time, 3 years ago, when her cat was seen walking along the churchyard wall at midnight. The unusually cold spring that followed her argument with the miller. The fact that she never bore children despite 15 years of marriage. The process by which these fragments of ordinary life are transformed into evidence of supernatural wrongdoing reveals the terrifying malleability of truth in a world governed by fear. When Marguerite's husband falls ill with a fever that lingers for weeks, the timing is seen as suspicious rather than unfortunate. His delirium, in which he sometimes fails to recognize his wife, becomes interpreted as supernatural confusion rather than the natural progression of illness. Even his eventual recovery is viewed with suspicion. Why did he survive when other men with similar fevers have died? The answer, whispered from house to house, seems obvious to minds trained to find supernatural explanations for natural events. The social mechanisms that once protected community members from false accusations have been systematically dismantled by the logic of the witch trials. Traditional concepts of character, reference, family, reputation, and community standing offer no protection when supernatural corruption is believed to hide behind the most innocent facades. Indeed, previous good reputation becomes almost a liability. As it suggests, the kind of cunning required to maintain a false appearance of virtue while practicing hidden evils. Marguerite's years of charitable work, her reputation for fairness in business dealings, her faithful attendance at church services, all of these become reinterpreted as evidence of her sophistication in deception rather than genuine goodness. The village children, innocent of the complex social and psychological forces at work, become unwitting instruments in this deadly process. Young Heinrich, barely 8 years old, mentions to his mother that Marguerite sometimes talks to her cat while working in her garden. This unremarkable behavior, common among people who spend much time alone, becomes magnified through the lens of supernatural suspicion. The child's observation is repeated, embellished, and transformed through multiple retellings until a simple woman talking to her pet becomes a witch consulting with her familiar spirit. The economic pressures that underlie many accusations reveal themselves more clearly as winter approaches and resources become scarce. Marguerite's bakery, once a source of community sustenance, now represents economic competition viewed through the distorting lens of supernatural suspicion. When other families struggle to afford bread while she maintains her modest prosperity, that success becomes evidence, not of business skill or good fortune, but of unholy assistance. The bitter irony is that the very services the community depends upon healing, midwifery, food preparation, are most likely to draw suspicion when they succeed too well or fail too obviously. The role of gender in shaping accusations becomes increasingly apparent as you observe the village dynamics. Men may face accusations of witchcraft, but they are far more likely to be seen as victims of supernatural manipulation rather than primary practitioners of dark arts. When the blacksmith reports strange dreams after arguing with Marguerite over the price of horseshoe nails, This experience is interpreted as evidence of her supernatural revenge, rather than his own possible guilt. The cultural assumption that women are more susceptible to diabolic influence, combined with their traditional roles as healers and wise women, creates a perfect storm of vulnerability. The process by which individual suspicion becomes community. Consensus follows predictable patterns that you begin to recognize with growing horror. First comes the period of observation, during which Marguerite's every action is scrutinized for hidden meaning. Her choice to wear a red shawl on Sunday is noted and discussed. Her decision to plant different herbs in her garden is observed and questioned. Her failure to attend one evening prayer service due to illness is remembered and weighted against her character. Each of these minor deviations from absolute conformity is recorded in the collective memory of the village, like entries in a ledger of guilt. The second phase involves the sharing and amplification of these observations. What begins as a casual mention, "Have you noticed how Marguerite's cat seems unusually intelligent?" evolves through repetition into established fact. Everyone knows Marguerite's cat is no ordinary animal. The collaborative nature of this process diffuses responsibility while strengthening conviction. No single person claims to have witnessed definitive proof of supernatural activity. Yet, the collective weight of minor observations creates a narrative that seems undeniably convincing to those who participate in its construction. The third phase brings the involvement of authority figures who can transform community suspicion into legal action. The village priest, Father Heinrich, has been trained to recognize signs of diabolic influence and has a professional obligation to investigate reports of supernatural activity. The local magistrate, appointed by distant authorities who demand evidence of vigilance against supernatural threats, faces pressure to demonstrate his effectiveness through successful prosecutions. These men operate within institutional frameworks that reward the discovery of guilt rather than the preservation of innocence, creating systematic incentives for the escalation of accusations. As winter settles fully over the village, the case against Marguerite reaches the point where formal proceedings become inevitable. The accumulation of suspicious incidents, the testimony of concerned neighbors, the professional opinions of religious and legal authorities, all converge to create an unstoppable momentum toward trial and likely execution. The woman who began this season as a respected member of the community now finds herself isolated, feared, and legally vulnerable to charges that carry a death sentence. The other women of the village watch this process with a mixture of horror and relief that reveals the psychological complexity of survival in such circumstances. Horror at witnessing the destruction of someone they have known and lived alongside for years. Relief that the community's need for a scapegoat has been satisfied by someone other than themselves. This emotional conflict creates a form of collective trauma that will mark the village long after individual trials have ended and specific victims have been forgotten. Let us now turn our attention from the general atmosphere of suspicion to the specific fate of one woman. His life became entangled in the deadly web of witch trial proceedings. Anne Hendricks was 43 years old when she first heard her name spoken in connection with supernatural activities, though she would not learn of these whispers until much later. Her story begins not with dramatic accusations or supernatural events, but with the quiet desperation of a woman trying to survive in a world that had grown increasingly hostile to female independence and traditional feminine wisdom. Anne lived in the town of Pendle, in the shadow of the infamous hill that had already given its name to some of England's most notorious witch trials. The year was 1634. In the memory of the Pendle witches executed 2 decades earlier still hung over the region like morning fog that never quite lifted. She occupied a small cottage on the outskirts of the town proper, a location that at once seemed like a blessing, close enough to town for commerce and community, far enough away for privacy and peace. Now that isolation, which had once provided comfort, marked her as living outside the protective oversight of immediate neighbors who might vouch for her activities and character. The cottage itself told the story of a woman who had learned to be self-sufficient out of necessity rather than choice. Anne had been widowed 8 years earlier when her husband Thomas succumbed to a fever that swept through the region. She had no children, a circumstance that had caused whispers even during her marriage, as childlessness was often interpreted as either divine punishment for hidden sins or evidence of supernatural prevention of natural fertility. The small garden behind her home contained the herbs and vegetables that formed the foundation of her survival. Common plants like cabbage and turnips for sustenance, medicinal herbs like chamomile and willow bark that she could trade for other necessities. Anne's reputation as a healer had developed gradually over the years following her husband's death. Faced with a choice between destitution and finding some means of supporting herself, she had turned to the knowledge passed down from her grandmother, who had served the community as a wise woman for decades. This knowledge encompassed not just the preparation of herbal remedies, but the broader understanding of women's health, childbirth assistance, and the treatment of common ailments that plagued rural communities where professionally trained physicians were rare and expensive. Her healing practice brought her into contact with the most intimate aspects of her neighbors' lives. She attended difficult births, sitting through long nights with women in labor, offering not just herbal pain relief, but the comfort of experienced female presence during one of life's most dangerous passages. She treated children's fevers, mixing tinctures that brought relief to desperate parents watching their little ones burn with illness. She provided remedies for the digestive complaints, joint pains, and skin conditions that made daily life miserable for working people whose physical labor was essential to their survival. This intimate knowledge of her community's medical needs and personal secrets would eventually become one of the pillars of the case against her. In a world increasingly suspicious of female knowledge, particularly knowledge that dealt with the mysteries of birth, death, and healing, Anne's expertise marked her as potentially dangerous. Each successful treatment became evidence of supernatural assistance, each failure proof of malevolent intent held in check only by payment or fear. The very success that kept her from starvation also marked her for eventual destruction. The first formal complaint against Anne emerged from a case that had seemed, at the time, like a testament to her skill and compassion. Margaret Wright, the wife of a prosperous farmer, had endured 3 difficult miscarriages before seeking Anne's help with a 4th pregnancy. Anne had prepared special teas to strengthen Margaret's body, provided careful guidance about rest and nutrition, and attended the birth when labor finally began. The child, a healthy daughter, survived, as did the mother, in an age when both outcomes were far from guaranteed. For 2 years, the Wright family had been grateful for Anne's assistance, often sending small gifts of food or fabric to express their appreciation. But when their daughter began experiencing seizures at the age of 18 months, gratitude transformed into suspicion with terrifying speed. The seizures, which modern medical knowledge would likely attribute to epilepsy or other neurological conditions, were interpreted through the lens of supernatural causation. If Anne had the power to ensure a successful birth, did she not also have the power to harm the child she had helped bring into the world? The transformation of Anne from healer to suspect reveals the impossible position in which women with medical knowledge found themselves during this period. Success in healing suggested supernatural assistance. Failure implied malevolent intent. And even partial success could be interpreted as evidence of powers being deliberately held in restraint. When young Mary Wright's seizures worsened despite Anne's additional treatments, the failure was seen not as the limitation of herbal medicine in treating serious neurological conditions, but as proof that Anne was the source of the problem rather than its potential solution. The Wright family's accusations gained credibility. through the testimony of other community members who began to reinterpret past events in light of these new suspicions. The widow Johnson recalled that her cow had stopped giving milk for several weeks following an argument with an overpayment for treating Johnson's infected wound. The miller's wife remembered that her husband had suffered unusually severe back pain after refusing to trade flour for Ann's herbal preparations. The blacksmith's son reported that his recurring nightmares had begun shortly after Ann had treated his injured hand with an herbal poultice that had, admittedly, healed the wound completely. Each of these testimonies followed the same pattern: initial success or normalcy followed by some form of misfortune that could be attributed to Ann's supernatural retaliation for perceived slights or inadequate compensation. The logical inconsistencies in these accusations, why wouldn't heal people successfully only to later harm them, were smoothed over by the prevailing belief in the complex motivations and long-term coding attributed to those in league with dark forces. Ann's reputation for fairness in her dealings, her reasonable prices, her willingness to treat the poor without payment, all became reinterpreted as evidence of cunning rather than compassion. The legal proceedings against Ann began with a formal complaint filed by the Wright family with the local magistrate. The magistrate, Robert Thornton, was a man caught between competing pressures that shaped his approach to such cases. On one hand, he faced expectations from higher authorities to demonstrate vigilance against supernatural threats that were believed to undermine both religious faith and civil order. On the other hand, he was aware that false accusations could destroy innocent lives and create community discord that would be difficult to repair. Magistrate Thornton's initial approach was cautious and methodical. He ordered that Ann be questioned about the specific accusations while allowing her to remain in her own home under informal supervision. This preliminary investigation revealed the complexity of her situation and the genuine affection many community members still felt for her despite the growing climate of suspicion. Several women came forward to testify about Ann's successful treatments of their own ailments and her compassionate care during childbirth. The local priest, while expressing appropriate concern about any supernatural activities, noted that Ann had always been regular in her church attendance and had never shown any signs of heretical beliefs. However, the momentum of accusation proved stronger than these expressions of support. As word of the investigation spread throughout the region, other individuals came forward with their own complaints and suspicious memories. A traveling merchant reported that his horse had gone lame shortly after he had refused to purchase herbal remedies from an at what he considered an unreasonable price. A young woman claimed that she had begun experiencing troubling dreams after Ann had looked at her with what seemed like unusual intensity during a chance encounter at the A market. The accumulation of these testimonies created a narrative that seemed to demonstrate a pattern of supernatural activity extending over several years. The fact that many of the incidents were minor and that Ann's alleged responses seemed disproportionate to the supposed provocations was interpreted not as evidence of innocence, but as proof of the petty vindictiveness that was believed to characterize those who practiced malevolent magic. The portrait that emerged from these testimonies was of a woman who used her healing abilities as a cover for more sinister activities. Someone who maintained a facade of helpfulness while secretly practicing supernatural revenge against those who crossed her as autumn progressed toward winter. The pressure on Magistrate Thornton to move beyond preliminary investigation toward formal trial became increasingly difficult to resist. The community's anxiety about supernatural threats had been heightened by Ann's case, and many residents expressed the view that allowing a suspected witch to remain at large, even under supervision, posed an unacceptable risk to public safety. The magistrate found himself facing a situation where maintaining Ann's provisional freedom might itself be interpreted as evidence of his inadequate vigilance, or, worse, his own susceptibility to supernatural influence. The formal trial of Hendricks began on a cold November morning in 1634. and the frost on the courthouse windows created patterns that some spectators would later claim resembled supernatural symbols. The courthouse itself was a modest stone building that served multiple functions in the community, a place for civil disputes, criminal proceedings, and the increasingly common witch trials that had become a grim feature of regional justice. The room that would determine Anne's fate was lit by tall windows that let in the gray autumn light. Accumulation supplemented by candles whose flickering flames cast dancing shadows that seemed to mirror the uncertainty and fear that permeated the proceedings. Magistrate Thornton had spent sleepless nights preparing for this trial, knowing that his handling of the case would be scrutinized, not only by the local community, but by higher authorities who expected demonstration of proper vigilance against supernatural threats. He had consulted the standard legal texts on witchcraft prosecution, including the influential Malleus Maleficarum and more recent English legal precedents that provided frameworks for evaluating evidence of supernatural crimes. These texts offered guidance on identifying witches, interpreting evidence of supernatural activity, and conducting interrogations designed to reveal hidden guilt. But they provided little comfort for a magistrate who secretly harbored doubts about the validity of many accusations, and entered the courtroom under escort, her hands bound not with iron shackles, but with rope, a small mercy that reflected the preliminary nature of her detention and the magistrate's cautious approach to her case. She wore her best dress, a simple but well-maintained garment of dark blue wool that spoke to her modest prosperity and careful habits. Her hair was covered by a white linen cap, and her demeanor was composed despite the obvious fear in her eyes. The spectators who filled the room's wooden benches studied her appearance for signs of guilt or innocence, interpreting everything from her posture to her complexion through the lens of supernatural suspicion. The prosecution was led by Thomas Whitmore, a lawyer who had gained regional prominence through his successful handling of previous witchcraft cases. Whitmore was a man shaped by the religious and legal climate of his time, genuinely convinced that supernatural threats posed real dangers to Christian communities, and that vigorous prosecution of suspected witches was both a legal duty and a religious obligation. His approach to Anne's case reflected the methodical accumulation of circumstantial evidence that characterized most witch trials, building a case through the careful presentation of multiple testimonies that created a cumulative impression of guilt despite the absence of direct evidence of supernatural activities. The first phase of the trial focused on establishing Anne's reputation and character within the community. Whitmore called witnesses who testified about her activities as a healer, carefully framing her medical practice as evidence of suspicious knowledge rather than legitimate skill. Margaret Wright, whose daughter's seizures had initiated the formal accusations, testified tearfully about her child's condition and her growing belief that Anne's involvement in the birth had somehow marked the infant for supernatural affliction. Her testimony was emotionally powerful, focusing not on technical details of medical treatment, but on her maternal anguish and her desperate need to find an explanation for her daughter's suffering. The testimony of other community members followed a similar pattern, with each witness describing incidents that seemed innocuous when considered individually, but took on sinister significance when presented as part of a broader pattern of supernatural activity. The miller's wife described how her husband's back pain had worsened after his dispute with an overpayment, emphasizing the timing of the onset of symptoms rather than the physically demanding nature of his work. The blacksmith testified about his son's nightmares, attributing them to Anne's treatment of the boy's injured hand rather than to the traumatic nature of the accident that had caused the original wound. Anne's defense was handled by a local lawyer named Edmund Barnes, conscientious man who faced the difficult task of defending a client in a legal system that was structurally biased toward finding guilt in witchcraft cases. Barnes understood that direct denials of supernatural activity, while truthful, were often interpreted as evidence of the cunning that supposedly characterized those in league with dark forces. Instead, he attempted to present alternative explanations for the incidents described by prosecution witnesses, emphasizing the natural causes that could account for the misfortunes attributed to Anne's supernatural intervention. Barnes called witnesses who testified to Anne's character and her legitimate medical knowledge, including several women who had benefited from her assistance during childbirth, and others who had recovered from illnesses under her care. The village priest, while careful not to contradict the general assumption that supernatural threats were real and dangerous, testified that Anne had always been regular in her religious observances and had never shown any signs of heretical beliefs or suspicious behavior during church services. An elderly woman who had known Anne's grandmother testified about the long tradition of herbal healing in Anne's family, emphasizing that her knowledge came from generations of accumulated wisdom rather than supernatural sources. However, the structural dynamics of witch trials worked against Anne's defense in ways that became increasingly apparent as the proceedings continued. Each successful healing that Barnes presented as evidence of Anne's legitimate skill was reinterpreted by the prosecution as proof of her supernatural abilities. Her regular church attendance was described as evidence of her cunning in maintaining a false appearance of piety. Even her reputation for fair dealing and reasonable prices was twisted into evidence of the careful planning that supposedly characterized those who used supernatural abilities to advance their earthly interests. The examination of physical evidence revealed the pseudo-scientific methods that were commonly employed in witch trials of this period. Anne's body was searched for devil's marks, unusual moles, scars, or blemishes that were believed to be signs of supernatural corruption. The searchers, 2 midwives appointed by the court, found a small scar on Anne's shoulder from a childhood accident and a mole on her back that she had carried since birth. Under the interpretive framework of witch trial evidence, these natural features became potential proof of supernatural marking, their ordinary origins forgotten in the atmosphere of suspicion that pervaded the courtroom. Anne's personal possessions were also subjected to intense scrutiny. Her collection of herbs and medical supplies, gathered and maintained through years of careful practice, was presented to the court as evidence of supernatural materials. Common plants like willow, bark, and chamomile were described in terms that emphasized their potential use in harmful preparations rather than their well-known medicinal properties. A notebook in which Anne had recorded her grandmother's recipes and remedies was interpreted as a collection of magical formulas. Its careful documentation of healing practices reframed as evidence of systematic supernatural study. The questioning of Anne herself revealed the impossible position in which accused witches found themselves during formal interrogation. When she denied the charges against her, denials were interpreted as evidence of the deception that supposedly characterized those in league with dark forces. She attempted to explain the natural basis for her healing knowledge. Her explanations were seen as attempts to conceal the supernatural sources of her abilities. When she showed emotion during particularly intense questioning, her tears were described as evidence of guilt and remorse, while her attempts to maintain composure were interpreted as unnatural calm that suggested supernatural assistance in controlling her responses. The trial proceedings extended over several days, during which the community's attention was focused intensely on the courtroom drama unfolding within their midst. The daily sessions became public spectacles that reinforced the community's sense of being under supernatural threat, while simultaneously providing the satisfaction of taking decisive action against that perceived danger. Children were brought to observe the proceedings as educational experiences, learning through direct witness how their community protected itself against supernatural corruption. As the trial progressed, additional witnesses came forward with new accusations and suspicious memories, a common phenomenon in witch trials that reflected both the heightened attention focused on the accused and the community's collective investment in reaching a guilty verdict. A traveling peddler testified that his goods had spoiled unusually quickly after Anne had examined them without making a purchase. A young mother claimed that her infant had developed a rash after Anne had complimented the child's appearance during a chance encounter at the market. Each new testimony added weight to the prosecution's case while making Anne's defense increasingly difficult to maintain. The legal framework within which these proceedings took place was heavily influenced by continental European precedents that assumed the reality of witchcraft as a supernatural crime requiring special investigative and prosecutorial techniques. English law had adapted these continental models while maintaining certain procedural protections. But the practical effect was still a legal system that was structurally designed to produce guilty verdicts in cases where community suspicion had reached the point of formal accusation. The burden of proof was effectively reversed. The accused witches required to demonstrate their innocence rather than prosecutors being required to prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt. Magistrate Thornton found himself presiding over proceedings that followed legal precedent while violating his growing private doubts about the validity of witchcraft accusations. His legal training and professional experience had taught him to value evidence-based reasoning and careful evaluation of witness testimony. But the framework of witchcraft prosecution required him to accept supernatural explanations for natural events and to interpret circumstantial evidence through assumptions about diabolic activity that his rational mind increasingly questioned. The climax of the trial came with the prosecution's final arguments, in which Thomas Whitmore skillfully wove together all the testimonies, physical evidence, and circumstantial details into a comprehensive narrative of supernatural guilt. He painted a picture of an as-a-cunning practitioner of malevolent magic who had used her reputation as a healer to gain access to her victims while concealing her true supernatural activities behind a facade of medical legitimacy. His presentation was emotionally powerful and legally sophisticated, addressing potential objections while building toward the inevitable conclusion that community safety required. Anne's conviction and execution. Edmund Barnes faced the nearly impossible task of responding to this carefully constructed case with arguments that would resonate within the supernatural worldview that dominated witchcraft trials. He attempted to emphasize the natural explanations for all the incidents described by prosecution witnesses while highlighting the absence of any direct evidence of supernatural activity. He pointed out the inconsistencies in witness testimonies and the tendency for memories to be reshaped by suggestion and community pressure. But his rational arguments struggled to compete with the emotional power of the prosecution's narrative and the community's collective investment in finding Anne guilty. The jury that would determine Anne's fate consisted of 12 men drawn from the local community, individuals who had been selected for their solid reputations and presumed good judgment, but who brought to their deliberations all the supernatural beliefs and community pressures that had shaped the trial proceedings. These men faced the responsibility of making a life or death decision in an atmosphere where acquittal might be interpreted as evidence of their own susceptibility to supernatural influence or their inadequate concern for community safety. The jury retired to deliberate in Hendrick's fate on a Thursday evening when the early winter darkness had already settled over the courthouse and the surrounding town. The 12 men who would decide whether she lived or died gathered in a small chamber adjacent to the main courtroom, their faces illuminated by the uncertain light of oil lamps that cast wavering shadows on the whitewashed walls. The weight of their responsibility hung in the air like smoke, mixing with a sense of unwashed wool, nervous perspiration, and the lingering odors of the day's testimonies, fear, desperation, and the peculiar stillness that seems to accumulate in rooms where life and death decisions are made. Thomas Fletcher, prosperous merchant who served as the jury's foreman, found himself struggling with doubts that he dared not voice openly to his fellow jurors. His experience in trade had taught him to evaluate evidence carefully, to distinguish between reliable information and wishful thinking. to recognize when testimony might be shaped by self-interest or emotional investment rather than objective truth. Yet, the legal framework within which they operated is the community expectations that surrounded their deliberations, and his own deep-seated beliefs about the reality of supernatural threats created a context where his rational doubts seemed almost treasonous to express. The other jurors brought their own complex mixture of conviction, uncertainty, and social pressure to the deliberation process. John Whitman, the local cooper, had known Anne for years and had personally benefited from her medical treatments when his wife suffered complications during the birth of their third child. He remembered Anne's gentle competence during that frightening night, her calm guidance that had helped bring both mother and infant safely through a dangerous passage. Yet, he also remembered the community's growing conviction that Anne's healing abilities came from supernatural sources, and he feared that his personal gratitude might blind him to evidence of her hidden guilt. The deliberation process revealed the profound difficulty of maintaining individual judgment in the face of collective pressure and supernatural worldview that dominated their time. Each juror who expressed doubts about Anne's guilt found himself questioned not just about his interpretation of evidence, but about his own spiritual discernment and community loyalty. The assumption that witchcraft was real and dangerous created a framework where acquittal required not just reasonable doubt about specific accusations, but positive evidence of innocence that was nearly impossible to provide in cases involving alleged supernatural crimes. Samuel Hartwell, farmer whose crops had failed the previous season, found himself particularly susceptible to the prosecution's arguments about Anne's supposed ability to cause agricultural disasters through supernatural means. His rational mind understood that crop failures had multiple natural causes: poor weather, soil depletion, plant diseases that affected entire regions regardless of any individual's activities. Yet, his desperation to find some explanation for his family's economic hardship made the supernatural narrative emotionally appealing, offering both a clear cause for his misfortune and the hope that Anne's punishment might prevent future disasters. The jury's deliberations extended through the night and into the following day, creating an atmosphere of suspended tension that gripped the entire community. People gathered in small groups throughout the town, speculating about the outcome while expressing their own opinions about Anne's guilt or innocence. The extended nature of the deliberations was itself interpreted as significant. Some saw it as evidence that the jurors were taking their responsibilities seriously and carefully weighing all evidence, while others worried that prolonged discussion might indicate dangerous sympathy for the accused or insufficient appreciation of the supernatural threats she supposedly represented. As dawn broke on Friday morning, the jury had still not reached a unanimous verdict. The legal system required consensus among all 12 jurors. But achieving that consensus proved difficult when individual members brought such different perspectives and concerns to their evaluation of the evidence. The pressure to reach a decision intensified as the day progressed, with Magistrate Thornton sending increasingly frequent messages, inquiring about their progress and reminding them of their duty to the community and to justice. The breakthrough in their deliberations came when young William Barnsnow, relation to Anne's defense lawyer, recalled an incident from several months earlier that had not been mentioned during the trial testimony. He remembered seeing Anne walking alone near the old oak tree that local folklore associated with supernatural gatherings. And while he could provide no evidence of any wrongdoing, his observation seemed to tip the balance of probability in the minds of his fellow jurors. The timing of this memory, emerging only after hours of intense discussion, might have been questioned under normal circumstances. But in the charged atmosphere of which trial deliberations, it was accepted as genuine recollection that had been suppressed by supernatural influence until this crucial moment. By Friday afternoon, the jury had reached their unanimous verdict: guilty of practicing witchcraft and maleficium. The decision was announced in the courthouse with Anne present to hear the pronouncement of her fate. She received the verdict with outward composure that some interpreted as evidence of supernatural assistance in maintaining unnatural calm, while others saw it as the dignity of an innocent woman facing an unjust fate with courage. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the wooden rail before her, the only visible sign of the terror that must have coursed through her as she heard the words that sealed her doom. Magistrate Thornton pronounced the sentence with visible reluctance, his voice carrying the weight of legal obligation rather than personal conviction. Anne Hendricks, he intoned, you have been found guilty by a jury of your peers of the crime of witchcraft, hanging, and the practice of maleficium against the people of this community. The penalty prescribed by law for such crimes is death by hanging, and it is the order of this court that you be taken from this place to the place of execution, and there hanged by the neck until you are dead. And may God have mercy upon your soul. The formal pronouncement of the death sentence transformed Anne's legal status from accused to condemned, initiating a series of procedures designed to provide opportunities for last-minute confessions while preparing for the public execution that would serve both as punishment for her alleged crimes and as a warning to others who might be tempted to engage in similar supernatural activities. She was returned to her cell to await execution, scheduled for the following Monday morning to allow adequate time for the construction of the gallows and the notification of surrounding communities whose residents might wish to witness the proceedings. The 3 days between Anne's sentencing and her scheduled execution created a strange atmosphere of anticipation and solemnity throughout the region. Carpenters worked steadily to construct the gallows on the town common, their hammering creating a rhythmic soundtrack that reminded everyone of the approaching spectacle. Local clergy prepared sermons that would use Anne's case as an example of the dangers of supernatural corruption and the importance of maintaining vigilance against diabolic influences. Merchants anticipated the crowds that would gather for the execution, stocking additional food and drink to serve the visitors who would travel from neighboring towns to witness the proceedings. Anne spent these final days in a stone cell beneath the courthouse, a cramped space lit only by what daylight filtered through a small barred window set high in the wall. She was visited repeatedly by local clergy who urged her to confess her supernatural activities and name any confederates who might have assisted her in practicing witchcraft. These visits were motivated partly by genuine concern for Anne's spiritual welfare and partly by the practical value that confessions provided in justifying executions and identifying additional suspects for future prosecution. The Reverend Dr. Marcus Weatherby, the senior clergyman in the region, spent long hours with Anne during her final days, alternating between compassionate counseling and persistent interrogation about her alleged supernatural activities. Dr. Weatherby was a learned man who had studied at Cambridge and was well versed in theological discussions of witchcraft and diabolic possession. But his encounters with Anne left him troubled by doubts that he struggled to reconcile with his professional obligations and religious convictions. Anne maintained her innocence throughout these final conversations, insisting that her healing knowledge came from her grandmother's teachings and her own years of observation and experience, rather than from supernatural sources. She expressed deep sorrow for the suffering that the community's children were experiencing, the seizures, nightmares, and other ailments attributed to her influence, but continued to deny any role in causing their afflictions. Her consistency in these denials, even when faced with imminent death, impressed some observers as evidence of either complete innocence or supernatural assistance in maintaining deception until the very end. The physical conditions of Anne's imprisonment during these final days reflected the period's assumptions about the treatment of condemned criminals. She was provided with adequate food and water, allowed to maintain basic cleanliness, and permitted to receive visits from clergy and family members who wished to offer comfort during her final hours. Yet the cell was cold, damp, and barely large enough for a person to lie down, creating an environment that was psychologically oppressive, even without deliberate cruelty. Anne's few surviving relatives, a sister who lived in a neighboring village, and a nephew who worked as a blacksmith's apprentice, were permitted to visit her during these final days. These meetings were supervised by guards who recorded any conversations for evidence of confessions or references to supernatural activities. But they also provided Anne with a human connection and emotional support that made her final hours somewhat more bearable. Her sister brought clean clothing for the execution and spent hours simply sitting within, offering the comfort of familial presence without the pressure for confessions that characterized her clerical visitors. The Sunday evening before her scheduled Monday morning execution, Anne was permitted to receive communion from Dr. Weatherby's final opportunity for spiritual preparation that also served as a test of her relationship with sacred objects and rituals. According to contemporary beliefs, those in league with diabolic forces would be unable to participate normally in Christian sacraments, experiencing physical discomfort or supernatural interference that would reveal their true nature. Anne's ability to receive communion without apparent difficulty was noted by observers. Though it was interpreted differently by different witnesses, some saw it as evidence of her innocence, others as proof of the sophisticated deception that supposedly characterized experienced practitioners of witchcraft. The final night of Anne's life was spent in restless wakefulness, punctuated by periods of prayer and quiet conversation with the guard who had been assigned to prevent any supernatural escape attempts. The guard, a young man named Peter Carver, found himself moved by Anne's composure and dignity in the face of approaching death. His own faith in the justice of her conviction began to waver as he observed her behavior during these final hours, noting the absence of the malevolent defiance or supernatural signs that he had been taught to expect from condemned witches. As dawn approached on Monday morning, the preparations for Anne's execution reached their final stages. The gallows stood ready on the town common, surrounded by barriers that would control crowd movement while ensuring maximum visibility for the educational and deterrent effects that public executions were intended to provide. Local officials reviewed their procedures one final time, ensuring that all legal requirements would be met and that the execution would proceed smoothly without disruptions that might undermine its solemnity and effectiveness as a demonstration of community justice. Anne was awakened before sunrise and provided with her final meal, simple bread and ale that she consumed with apparent appetite, her body's instinctive hunger overriding the psychological terror of her situation. She was assisted in dressing in the clean clothes her sister had brought, including a white cap that would help the assembled crowd identify her clearly during the execution proceedings. Her hands were bound with rope rather than iron shackles, a small mercy that reflected both legal custom and the practical requirements of the hanging process. The procession from the courthouse to the execution site began as the morning sun cast long shadows across the town common. Anne walked between two guards, followed by Dr. Weatherby and other clergy who would oversee the final religious observances. Behind them came local officials, jury members, and prominent citizens whose presence would lend solemnity and authority to the proceedings. The crowd that had gathered to witness the execution numbered in the hundreds, drawn from the immediate community and neighboring towns by curiosity, religious conviction, and the grim entertainment that public executions provided in an age with few other forms of public spectacle. Anne's final moments on the gallows platform were conducted according to established ritual that balanced legal requirements, religious considerations, and public expectations. She was permitted to make a final statement to the assembled crowd. It's an opportunity that condemned criminals traditionally used to confess their guilt, warn others against similar crimes, and express repentance for their actions. Anne's final words, delivered in a voice that carried clearly across the silent crowd, maintained her innocence while expressing forgiveness for those who had brought her to this fate and sorrow for the suffering that the community's children continued to experience. The The actual execution was carried out with a mechanical efficiency that characterized public hangings of the period. Anne was positioned beneath the noose. The rope was secured around her neck, and the trapdoor was opened with swift precision that was intended to minimize suffering while ensuring that the legal sentence was fully carried out. Her death was relatively quick by the standards of the time, though the several minutes required for complete cessation of life seemed to stretch endlessly for those witnesses who had begun to question the justice of her fate. The crowd dispersed slowly after. Anne's body was cut down and prepared for burial in the unconsecrated ground reserved for executed criminals. Some spectators left with renewed conviction that they had witnessed appropriate justice for supernatural crimes that threatened their community's safety and spiritual welfare. Others departed with troubled consciences and growing doubts about the reliability of witch trial procedures and the justice of executing individuals based on circumstantial evidence and supernatural accusations. The execution had served its intended functions of punishment and deterrence, but it had also planted seeds of doubt that would eventually contribute to the decline of witch trial prosecutions in England and other European countries. Three centuries after Anne Hendricks drew her final breath on that cold November morning, renovation work at a Tudor manor house in Somerset would reveal secrets that had been hidden within its walls since the height of the English witch trials. The house, known as Bramblewood Manor, had been purchased by a London couple seeking to restore one of England's historic properties to its former grandeur. They had no way of knowing that their innocent home improvement project would unlock a cache of documents that would provide unprecedented insight into the inner lives of women who faced accusations of witchcraft, offering voices that had been silenced by fear and death, but preserved by desperate hope and careful concealment. The discovery occurred on a rain-soaked Thursday in October 1934, when workmen removing rotted timbers from what had once been the Manus kitchen discovered a carefully sealed cavity within the thick stone walls. The space, no larger than a modern shoebox, had been lined with oiled leather to protect its contents from moisture and decay. Inside, wrapped in layers of silk that had somehow survived 3 centuries of English weather, laid 17 letters written on parchment and paper, each one signed with a woman's name, each one a confession to crimes of witchcraft that the writers claimed they had never committed. Dr. Margaret Pemberton, a historian from Cambridge University who was called in to examine the find, would later describe that moment of discovery as one of the most profound experiences of her academic career. The letters represented something historians had long sought but rarely found: authentic contemporary accounts written by the accused themselves, rather than the official court records, witness testimonies, or clerical observations that comprised most surviving documentation from the witch trial period. Here were the voices of the women themselves, speaking across centuries with a clarity and honesty that no official document could provide. The handwriting in the letters varied dramatically, reflecting the different educational backgrounds and social circumstances of their authors. Some were written in elegant script that spoke of aristocratic education or clerical training, while others showed the careful, painstaking penmanship of working women who had learned to read and write despite their humble circumstances. A few were dictated to scribes, marked by the formal language and careful phrasing that characterized professional writing of the period, yet still carrying the emotional weight of personal testimony delivered under the shadow of death. The earliest letter in the collection was dated 1612 and signed by a woman named Catherine Whitmore, who identified herself as the wife of a prosperous wool merchant from the nearby town of Taunton. Her letter, written in brown ink that had faded to the color of autumn leaves, began with words that would haunt Dr. Pemberton for years to come. I write these words knowing that I shall never see another sunrise, yet compelled by the hope that someday Someone will read them and know the truth of what has befallen us innocent women in these dark times. Catherine's letter described her arrest following accusations made by a servant girl, claimed to have witnessed supernatural activities in the Whitmore household. The accusations had emerged during a dispute over wages when the girl had been dismissed for theft and had sought revenge by claiming that her former mistress practiced witchcraft. Catherine's letter provided detailed descriptions of the interrogation techniques used by her accusers, including sleep deprivation, threats against her family members, and the use of physical discomfort to encourage confession to crimes she maintained she had never committed. What made Catherine's testimony particularly valuable was her detailed description of the psychological pressure applied during her imprisonment and interrogation. She wrote of being told repeatedly that confession was her only hope of salvation, both legal and spiritual, and that maintaining her innocence would only result in more severe punishment and eternal damnation. The interrogators, she claimed, had shown her lists of other women who had confessed to witchcraft, suggesting that her continued denials made her appear unusually stubborn, or perhaps indicated that she was being sustained by supernatural assistance in maintaining her lies. The second letter, dated 1630 for the same year as Anne Hendrick's execution, came from a woman named Mary Blackwood, who described herself as a widow and herbalist living in a village near Glastonbury. Her letter was written in a shaking hand that suggested either advanced age or extreme physical distress, and it contained descriptions of torture techniques that were officially prohibited but apparently used. Nonetheless, during private interrogations of suspected witches, Mary wrote of being subjected to sleep deprivation for days at a time, forced to stand in uncomfortable positions until her legs gave way, and threatened with more severe physical punishment if she continued to maintain her innocence. Mary's letter also provided insight into the economic motivations that often underlie witchcraft accusations. She described how her modest prosperity as an herbalist had attracted the attention of neighbors, cruel, who struggled with poverty and who saw her success as evidence of supernatural assistance. When several of her customers experienced misfortunes that could be attributed to her supposed supernatural retaliation for inadequate payment or perceived slights, the accumulated resentment had crystallized into formal accusations that led to her arrest and trial. The third letter, unsigned but dated 1645, was written by someone who identified herself only as a minister's daughter who has been falsely accused. This letter was particularly sophisticated in its analysis of the witch trial phenomenon, suggesting that its author had received an unusually thorough education and possessed considerable intellectual sophistication. She wrote about the ways in which accusations of witchcraft were used to resolve community conflicts, settle personal vendettas, and redistribute property from vulnerable women to their accusers and the officials who prosecuted them. This anonymous letter also contained the most detailed description in the collection of the physical examinations to which accused witches were subjected, including searches for devil's marks and other supposed signs of supernatural corruption. The writer described the humiliation and violation of these procedures with clinical precision while maintaining her dignity and composure, creating one of the most powerful testimonies to feminine courage under extreme duress that had ever been discovered from this historical period. The fourth letter, dated 1647, came from someone named Elizabeth Hartwell, who described herself as a midwife whose successful practice had attracted suspicion, and several difficult births had concluded, with both mother and child surviving against the odds. Elizabeth's letter provided unique insight into the impossible position faced by women whose expertise in traditionally feminine areas of knowledge healing, childbirth, herbal medicine could be interpreted as evidence of supernatural abilities, regardless of the outcomes they achieved. Elizabeth wrote movingly about the ethical dilemmas faced by women with medical knowledge during the witch trial period. Success in healing suggested supernatural assistance, while failure implied malevolent intent or supernatural retaliation. Even partial success could be interpreted as evidence of deliberately withheld supernatural power, creating a situation where any exercise of medical knowledge carried potentially fatal risks. Her letter described the agonizing decisions faced by women who possessed knowledge that could save lives, but dared not use it for fear of attracting accusations of witchcraft. The fifth letter, dated 1649, was perhaps the most heartbreaking in the collection, written by a woman named Sarah Thompson, who identified herself as a mother of 4 young children. Her letter was addressed directly to her children, whom she would never see again, and contained detailed instructions for their care along with explanations of the accusations that had led to her imprisonment. Sarah's crime appeared to be nothing more than her success in maintaining a productive garden and household, despite her husband's death, achievements that had been interpreted by suspicious neighbors as evidence of supernatural assistance. Sarah's letter revealed the devastating impact of witch trial accusations on families, particularly children who were left orphaned when their mothers were executed and their fathers fled to avoid similar charges. She wrote about the provisions she had attempted to make for her children's welfare, including arrangements with relatives who might care for them and hidden savings that could support their basic needs. Her maternal love and concern for her children's future welfare shone through every line of her letter, creating a testament to feminine devotion and sacrifice that transcended the centuries. The remaining letters in the collection, spanning the years from 1650 to 1662, told similar stories of women whose lives had been destroyed by accusations based on community suspicion, personal vendettas, and economic competition, rather than any evidence of actual supernatural activity. Each letter provided unique details about the experiences of accused witches, but together they created a composite picture of systematic persecution that targeted women who were vulnerable due to their age, social status, economic circumstances, or possession of knowledge that could be interpreted as supernatural. Dr. Pemberton's analysis of the letters revealed several common themes that connected the experiences of women, separated by decades and geographical distance. First was the role of economic competition in generating accusations, with successful women frequently targeted by less prosperous neighbors who attributed their success to supernatural assistance rather than hard work or good fortune. Second was the use of witch trial accusations to resolve community conflicts and personal disputes, with formal charges of witchcraft serving as weapons in feuds that had little or nothing to do with supernatural activities. Third was the systematic use of psychological pressure and physical discomfort during interrogations, designed to break down the resistance of accused women and encourage confessions that justified their execution while providing names of additional suspects for future prosecution. Fourth was the economic incentive structure that rewarded accusers, witnesses, and officials for discovering and prosecuting witches, creating a system that generated its own momentum regardless of the actual guilt or innocence of the accused. The letters also revealed the sophisticated understanding many accused women had developed regarding the social and political forces that had trapped them in the witch trial system. Several writers demonstrated clear awareness that their accusations stemmed from community tensions and personal animosities rather than genuine belief in their supernatural activities. They understood that their trials were theatrical performances, designed to satisfy community needs for scapegoats and explanations for misfortune, rather than genuine attempts to determine guilt or innocence based on evidence. Perhaps most remarkably, the letters showed the extraordinary courage and dignity maintained by women facing certain death for crimes they had not committed. Each writer expressed concern for family members who would suffer from their executions, worry about community problems that would remain unresolved after their deaths, and hope that future generations might understand the truth about what had happened during the witch trial period. Their final testimonies revealed a strength of character and clarity of thought that belied the contemporary stereotypes of women as weak, emotional, and susceptible to supernatural corruption. The discovery of these letters at Bramblewood Manor would eventually contribute to a fundamental reassessment of the witch trial period in English history, providing evidence that many historians had long suspected but had never been able to document directly. The voices of the accused women themselves, preserved through their own careful efforts and historical testimony, offered perspectives that no official record could provide, and insights that would reshape scholarly understanding of one of the darkest chapters in the history of European persecution of women. As Dr. Pemberton continued her meticulous examination of the Bramblewood letters throughout the winter months of 1934, additional layers of meaning and historical significance began to emerge from these remarkable documents. Each letter, when analyzed not just for its immediate content, but for its subtle references to people, places, and events, revealed connections to a broader network of women who had faced similar accusations across England during the height of the witch trial period. These connections suggested a level of communication and mutual cues to women that had never been previously documented, supplying a form of underground solidarity that had developed despite the isolation and terror that defined their circumstances. The most intriguing discovery came when Dr. Pemberton noticed that several letters contained coded references that appeared to indicate meeting places and safe houses where accused women might find temporary refuge during their flight from accusers. The seventh letter in the collection, written by someone who signed herself only as Agnes of the Mill, contained what appeared to be directions to hidden sanctuaries disguised as descriptions of countryside, landmarks, and natural features. When Dr. Pemberton compared these descriptions with contemporary maps and her own knowledge of Somerset geography, she realized that Agnes was providing a carefully encrypted guide to locations where fleeing women might find assistance from sympathetic allies. This discovery led Dr. Pemberton to re-examine all the letters for similar coded information, revealing a sophisticated system of communication that had allowed accused women to share vital information about safe havens, trustworthy allies, and dangerous accusers across considerable geographical distances. The eighth letter, written by a woman named Judith Fairfax in 1651, contained what initially appeared to be random mentions of herbs and their supposed medicinal properties. But further analysis revealed that these botanical references were actually coded warnings about specific individuals who had proven dangerous to accused women in various communities. The network of mutual aid and information sharing revealed by these coded references painted a picture of accused women as far more organized and sophisticated in their response to persecution than historical accounts had previously suggested. Rather than being isolated victims who faced their accusations alone, many women had access to informal networks that provided practical assistance, emotional support, and strategic information about how to survive in a legal system that was systematically biased against them. The existence of these networks also suggested a level of political awareness and collective action among accused women that challenged contemporary assumptions about feminine passivity and helplessness. The ninth letter, dated 1653 and written by someone calling herself Margaret of the Forest, contained the most explicit references to organized resistance against witch trial persecution. Margaret wrote about sisters who had developed techniques for evading capture, methods for discrediting unreliable witnesses, and strategies for exposing the economic and personal motivations that often underlied accusations of witchcraft. Her letter suggested that some accused women had moved beyond passive endurance of persecution to active resistance against the system that threatened their lives. Margaret's letter also contained disturbing evidence of the sexual dimensions of Pequon, witch trial persecution that official records rarely acknowledged directly. She wrote about male accusers and interrogators who used their positions of authority to demand sexual favors from accused women, either as payment for leniency or as additional forms of humiliation and control. These references, written in carefully euphemistic language, that reflected the period's reluctance to discuss sexual matters directly. Nonetheless, provided clear evidence of the ways in which witch trial accusations created opportunities for sexual exploitation and abuse. The 10th letter, unsigned and undated, but apparently written during the 1650s, contained what appeared to be detailed instructions for suicide methods that would allow accused women to avoid the additional tortures and public humiliation of formal trial and execution procedures. The writer, who described herself as one who has chosen her own path to freedom, provided specific information about herbal preparations that could cause quick and relatively painless death, along with advice about timing and circumstances that would minimize the risk of discovery before the deed was complete. This letter raised profound questions about the psychological state of accused women and the extent to which the witch trial system drove its victims to desperation that extended beyond fear of death to active desire for self-destruction as a form of final control over their circumstances. The writer's clinical descriptions of suicide methods, combined with her philosophical justifications for choosing death over submission to judicial torture and public execution, revealed a level of intellectual sophistication and moral reasoning that contradicted contemporary assumptions about accused women as ignorant or mentally unstable. Dr. Pemberton's discovery of suicide instructions among the letters also led her to reconsider official records of women who had died in custody before their trials could be completed. Many such deaths had been attributed to natural causes, supernatural intervention, or accidents. But the Bramblewood letter suggested that at least some had been deliberate acts of self-destruction by women who chose death on their own terms rather than submission to the degradation and torture that formal prosecution entailed. The 11th letter, written by a woman who identified herself as Catherine the Healer, contained detailed descriptions of the medical knowledge that had led to her accusation, including specific recipes for herbal preparations that could treat everything from infected wounds to difficult childbirths. Catherine's letter was valuable not just as historical testimony about witch trial persecution, but as a rare surviving example of traditional feminine medical knowledge that had been passed down through generations of women healers before being criminalized and suppressed during the witch trial period. Catherine wrote about the impossible ethical position faced by women with medical knowledge during times of intense supernatural suspicion. She described cases where she had been asked to treat serious illnesses but had been forced to refuse because successful healing would inevitably lead to accusations of supernatural intervention, while failure to provide assistance would result in blame for deaths that might have been prevented. Her letter revealed the devastating impact of witch trial persecution on community healthcare, as traditional healers were driven into hiding or executed, leaving communities without access to medical knowledge that had sustained them for centuries. The 12th letter, dated 1658 and signed by Rose of the Garden, contained what appeared to be a systematic critique of the legal procedures used in witch trials, written by someone with considerable knowledge of English common law and legal precedent. Rose's letter suggested that she had either received formal legal education herself or had access to legal advisors who helped her understand the procedural violations and constitutional issues involved in witch trial prosecutions. Rose wrote about the systematic denial of traditional legal protections to accused witches, including the presumption of innocence, the right to confront accusers, and the requirement for credible evidence rather than spectral testimony and circumstantial speculation. Her letter provided detailed examples of how witch trial procedures violated established principles of English jurisprudence while being justified through appeals to special circumstances and supernatural considerations that placed accused witches outside the normal protection of common law. This legal analysis was particularly significant because it demonstrated that at least some accused women understood that their persecution violated established principles of justice and legal procedure, rather than representing legitimate applications of existing law to unusual circumstances. Rose's letter suggested that opposition to witch trials was based not just on their practical consequences, but on fundamental objections to their violation of legal principles that were considered essential to civilized governance. The 13th letter, written by someone signing herself Diana of the Moon, contained references to actual magical practices and supernatural beliefs that were apparently genuine, rather than the fabricated confessions that characterized most official trial records. Diana wrote about herbal preparations that were intended to influence natural events, ritual practices designed to provide protection against various dangers, and beliefs about the interconnection between human activities and natural forces that reflected pre-Christian religious traditions that had survived in rural communities despite centuries of official disapproval. Diana's letter was crucial because it provided evidence that at least some accused women did practice forms of folk magic and traditional healing that could be interpreted as witchcraft, even though these practices were fundamentally different from the diabolic activities described in official witch trial literature. Her descriptions revealed a complex world of traditional beliefs and practices that existed alongside official Christianity, providing alternative explanations for natural events and alternative approaches to dealing with the practical problems of daily life. However, Diana's letter also made clear that these traditional practices were intended to help rather than harm community members, focused on healing and protection rather than causing injury or misfortune to others. Her testimony suggested that the persecution of traditional folk practitioners during the witch trials represented not just the suppression of actual supernatural activities, but the systematic destruction of alternative medical and religious traditions that had coexisted with official Christianity for centuries. The 14th letter, undated but apparently from the 1660s, was written by someone who identified herself only as a mother who will not see her children grow. This letter contained perhaps the most emotionally powerful testimony in the entire collection, as its author described her anguish at being separated from her young children, and her fears about their fate after her expected execution. She wrote about the practical arrangements she had attempted to make for their care, the emotional preparation she had tried to provide them for life without their mother, and her desperate hopes that they might somehow survive and prosper, despite the stigma of having a mother who had been executed as a witch. This maternal letter also provided unique insights into the impact of witch trial persecutions on families and communities, describing how accusations against one family member created suspicion and social isolation that affected entire kinship networks. The writer described relatives who had distanced themselves from her family to avoid guilt by association, friends who had stopped visiting or speaking to her children, and economic hardships that had multiplied as her family's social network had collapsed under the weight of supernatural suspicion. The final letters in the collection, spanning the years from 1660 to 1662, documented the gradual decline of witch trial prosecutions in England, revealing that individual women continued to face accusations and persecution, even as the broader phenomenon was losing its legal and social support. These later letters showed accused women who were increasingly aware that the historical moment of intense witch trial activity was passing, creating both hope for their own survival and bitter awareness that their suffering had been part of a temporary madness that was already being recognized as excessive and unjust by contemporary observers.